They say a bear raised by humans can never survive in the wild. But what if survival isn't just about instinct, but about who you choose to trust? Deep in a vast, untamed forest, a young bear named Boone escapes captivity, unaware that he's now being hunted by men who see him as nothing more than a trophy. But one man stands in their way. Ethan Carter, a ranger who once saved Boone's life and now faces an impossible choice. Let nature take its course or risk everything to protect the bear who may never trust him again. What happens when a wild creature must decide between fear and loyalty, between running and fighting, and in the end, who is truly saving whom? The first light of dawn stretched across the dense forest, painting the treetops in hues of gold and amber. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. Ethan Carter tightened the straps of his backpack as he stepped onto the rugged trail, his boots pressing into the dew-covered soil. He had spent years walking these paths, memorizing every turn, every fallen log, every hidden stream. But today, something felt off. The radio on his belt crackled to life. "Ethan, we've got a situation. The bear is gone." The voice belonged to Officer Reynolds, one of the junior rangers stationed at the sanctuary. Ethan stopped mid-step, his grip tightening around the radio. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "The young grizzly, Boone. He escaped sometime last night. We found the enclosure's back gate wide open. He must have panicked and forced his way out." "We've got fresh tracks leading straight into the wild," Ethan cursed under his breath. Boone wasn't just any bear. He was an orphan, rescued as a cub after his mother was killed by poachers. He had never truly learned how to survive on his own. Ethan exhaled sharply. If Boone didn't find shelter or food soon, he wouldn't last long. Worse, if he wandered into the wrong part of the forest, he'd become an easy target for hunters. "I'll find him," Ethan said, adjusting the rifle slung across his shoulder. Not to harm Boone, but to protect him from what lurked beyond the safety of the sanctuary. The forest was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. Ethan set off, following the tracks in the soft mud. Boone's prints were deep, erratic, the markings of an animal that didn't know where it was going. The bear must have been running in fear, disoriented by the vastness of the wild. As Ethan moved deeper into the trees, an unsettling silence settled over the land. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind were absent. Something was wrong. Then he saw it. Broken branches, disturbed earth, boot prints. Not just Boone's tracks. Human tracks. A cold realization gripped Ethan's chest. He wasn't the only one looking for Boone, and whoever else was out here wasn't here to help. The wind carried the distant howls of the wild, rustling through the towering pines that stretched endlessly across the reserve. Ethan Carter moved swiftly through the thick undergrowth, his boots crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. He had followed the tracks for hours, each print in the soft earth confirming what he already knew. Boone was out here, alone. The young bear had escaped the sanctuary overnight, slipping through a damaged section of the enclosure fence. Boone had been raised in captivity after being rescued from poachers, but he had never been truly wild. He had never learned how to survive on his own, and now, with the vast and unforgiving wilderness ahead of him, Ethan feared the worst. He stopped, near a bend in the river, crouching down to examine a set of fresh prints in the mud. The spacing between them was uneven, the edges slightly dragged. Boone was tired. He had been running. A deep sigh escaped Ethan's lips. This wasn't good. A bear raised in human care, no matter how strong, was at a disadvantage in the wild. He didn't know how to hunt. He didn't know which plants were safe to eat. And worst of all, he didn't know how to fear the wrong kind of humans. Ethan knew he wasn't the only one tracking Boone. The reserve was meant to be a protected land, but there were always those who ignored the law, poachers who saw nothing but a pelt to sell, and hunters who didn't care that Boone had never harmed a soul. He tightened his grip on his rifle, not as a weapon, but as a last resort. He wasn't going to let them take Boone. A sudden sound cut through the silence, a rustling. Then a sharp snap of branches. Ethan's pulse quickened. He turned slowly, his trained eyes scanning the dense thicket ahead. The wind shifted, carrying. With it a scent. Earthy, musky, unmistakably bare. Boone was close. Ethan carefully stepped forward, moving past the thick foliage until he reached a clearing. And then he saw him. The young bear stood near the river's edge, his dark fur damp, his chest rising and falling with quick, nervous breaths. Boone's eyes darted around, his body tense, ears flicking at every sound. He was lost, confused. He had no idea where he was, no idea what to do. For a brief moment, Ethan felt a wave of relief. Boone was alive, but it was short-lived. The bear spotted him. Boone's body stiffened. His instincts took over. He reared slightly, his claws digging into the dirt. His breath came in heavy huffs, nostrils flaring. To him, Ethan was just another human in a world he didn't understand anymore. He didn't recognize him. Ethan slowly raised a hand. "Easy, Boone," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's me." But Boone didn't move closer. He took a step back, then another. His muscles tensed, his body preparing to flee. Ethan's heart pounded. If Boone ran deeper, into the reserve, it would be harder to protect him. He had to earn back the bear's trust, but out here, in the real world, trust was harder to gain. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Boone turned and bolted into the trees. Ethan swore under his breath. He had found Boone, but the chase had only just begun. The forest was alive with movement, but Ethan only had eyes for one shadow weaving through the trees. Boone was fast, too fast. The young bear's powerful legs carried him effortlessly over rocks and fallen logs, his dark fur blending into the dense undergrowth. Ethan struggled to keep pace, dodging branches, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. He couldn't lose him now. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in soft hues of amber and violet. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, but Ethan barely noticed. His entire focus was on Boone, the runaway bear who had no idea how much danger he was in. Then, without warning, Boone stopped. Ethan skidded to a halt, lowering, himself behind a thick tree trunk, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Boone stood at the edge of a riverbank, his body tense, ears perked forward. He sniffed the air, his large paws shifting uneasily against the loose gravel. He wasn't alone. Ethan followed the bear's gaze, and his stomach tightened. Across the river, 3 figures stood partially hidden by the trees. Men. Dressed in dark hunting gear, their postures relaxed but alert. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the rifles slung over their shoulders, the way their eyes scanned the area with practiced efficiency. Poachers. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had feared this. The reserve was meant to be protected land, but some men saw it only as an opportunity, a place where no one was watching, where rules could be broken without consequence. Except Ethan was watching. One of the men raised his hand, signaling to the others. They moved slowly, careful not to make noise, their eyes locked onto Boone. They were tracking him. Boone, unaware of the danger, lowered his head toward the water. He was thirsty, exhausted, his instincts clouded by confusion. He didn't sense the threat creeping closer. Ethan's fingers tightened around the stock of his rifle. He had seconds to decide, shout and scare Boone away. The poachers might take the shot. Stay silent? Boone could walk straight into their trap. Neither option was ideal. He needed Boone to recognize him. Slowly, Ethan stepped out from behind the tree, keeping his movements controlled, deliberate. He let out a low, familiar whistle, the same one he had used when Boone was just a cub. The sound cut through the air, soft yet sharp. Boone's ears twitched. He lifted his head, eyes flickering with something almost like recognition. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, a gun clicked. Ethan's pulse spiked. The poachers had seen him, and they weren't hesitating. Boone let out a deep huff, his body coiling with tension. His confusion was turning to fear. Ethan had to act now. "Boone, run!" he shouted, stepping further into the clearing, making himself visible to both the bear and the poachers. Boone's eyes locked onto him, wild and uncertain. Then, as if instinct finally kicked in, Boone bolted. Ethan saw the moment the poachers reacted, the way one of them lifted his rifle, aiming for the fleeing bear. Ethan fired first. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees like a warning. A clean, controlled shot, not to hit, but to disrupt. The bullet struck a nearby tree, sending bark flying, making the poachers flinch and duck for cover. It was all the time Boone needed. By the time the poachers regained their composure, the bear had vanished into the thick of the forest. Ethan took a slow step back, keeping his rifle aimed at the ground, but ready. A silent challenge. The poachers stared at him, tense, debating their next move. Finally, one of them, the leader, by the way he carried himself, let out a cold chuckle. "This ain't your fight, Ranger." Ethan's eyes were hard, unwavering. "This is my forest." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, the poachers turned and disappeared into the trees. Ethan exhaled, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had bought Boone time, but time wouldn't be enough. The poachers wouldn't give up so easily, and if Boone didn't learn to survive on his own soon, Ethan might not be able to save him next time. Boone ran deeper into the forest, his heavy paws pounding against the damp earth, his breath coming in ragged, panicked huffs. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. Away from the men, away from the strange sounds, away from the confusion that had clouded his instincts. But something felt different now. The man. Ethan. His scent had been familiar, buried beneath the fear and adrenaline. He had known him once, hadn't he? The memory was distant, blurred by time, but Boone couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen those eyes before, eyes that weren't like the others. Still, he kept running. Ethan followed as fast as he could, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground as he pushed through the dense undergrowth. Boone was fast, but he was leaving signs, deep tracks in the soil, broken branches where he had passed. The sun was setting now, casting golden light through the treetops, but Ethan barely noticed. His focus was singular. He had to find Boone, before something else did. A low growl echoed through the forest. Not from Boone. Ethan froze. Slowly he crouched behind a fallen tree, scanning the clearing ahead. A pack of coyotes. 4 of them, moving cautiously through the trees, ears flicking, sniffing the air. They were following Boone's trail. Ethan's jaw clenched. Boone was still young, still learning. If he didn't sense them in time, a rustle in the distance. Boone was near. The coyotes perked up, their sharp eyes locking onto something beyond Ethan's view. They had found him. Ethan had seconds to act. Gripping the strap of his rifle, he moved forward, stepping into the open. He didn't raise the weapon. He didn't need to. Instead, he let out a deep, commanding yell, sharp and loud, a sound meant to startle. The coyotes jerked back, their heads snapping toward him. For a moment, they hesitated. Then, one by one, they slunk away into the underbrush, disappearing into the growing darkness. Ethan exhaled. That was close. And then, a low rumble behind him. He turned slowly. Boone stood at the edge of the clearing, his massive body partially hidden by the trees. His dark eyes locked onto Ethan, cautious but no longer panicked. Ethan didn't move. This was the moment. "You remember me, don't you?" His voice was calm, steady. Boone huffed, shifting his weight. He didn't run this time. Ethan took a slow step forward. Boone didn't retreat. A flicker of trust sparked between them, fragile but real. Boone had nowhere else to go, and something deep inside him knew Ethan wasn't here to hurt him. The ranger lowered himself onto a rock, making his posture as non-threatening as possible. He pulled his backpack off his shoulders, carefully reaching inside. A small package. Dried fish. Something Boone had been fed as a cub. He unwrapped it, holding a piece in his palm. Waiting. Patience. For a long time, Boone just stared. Then, cautiously, he stepped forward. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare break the fragile trust forming between them. Boone sniffed the air, his large nose twitching. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he took the fish from Ethan's hand. Ethan exhaled, the tension leaving his body. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the last of the sunlight faded, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Boone wasn't just a runaway anymore. He was something more. He was learning to survive, and for the first time, he wasn't doing it alone, and if Boone didn't learn to survive on his own soon, Ethan might not be able to save him next time. The night had settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, the only sounds being the rustling of the wind through the towering pines and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Somewhere in the darkness, Boone moved silently, his massive paws barely making a sound as he followed Ethan through the trees. Ethan kept his steps careful and deliberate. Boone was finally trusting him again, but trust alone wouldn't keep the bear safe. He had to get him away from the poacher's path before they found another chance to strike. He glanced over his shoulder, catching Boone's dark silhouette against the moonlit clearing. The bear was growing stronger, his muscles more defined, his steps more confident. But he was still young, still inexperienced in the ways of the wild, and that made him vulnerable. A sudden metallic snap shattered the silence. Boone let out a deep, pained roar. Ethan spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. Boone had stumbled back, his front paw caught in a steel snare hidden beneath a bed of leaves, a poacher's trap. Ethan cursed under his breath and rushed forward. The bear let out another guttural growl, thrashing against the restraint. The steel teeth of the trap had clamped down just above his paw, not deep enough to break bone, but tight enough to hurt. "Easy, buddy," Ethan murmured, dropping to one knee. Boone's breathing was heavy, his eyes wide with panic. His instincts told him to fight, to break free, but doing so would only make the wound worse. Ethan reached for his knife, his hands steady despite the surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. "I got you," he whispered, carefully working the blade between the steel and Boone's thick fur. Then, a twig snapped. Ethan's body tensed. They weren't alone. A voice, low and amused, drifted through the darkness. Well, what do we have here?" Ethan looked up, his jaw tightening. The poachers had found them. 3 men stepped into the clearing, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, their faces partially obscured by the flickering moonlight. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a smug grin, let out a chuckle. "Looks like we saved ourselves the trouble of tracking him down." Ethan's grip tightened on his knife. "Let him go," the leader scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't get it, Ranger. That bear's worth more to us than your damn badge." Boone let out a low, rumbling growl, his muscles tensing despite the pain. He could sense the threat. Ethan's mind raced. Fighting them outright wasn't an option. 3 against 1, with rifles aimed and ready, Boone wouldn't stand a chance. If they decided to shoot, he needed to buy time. "I don't think you understand," Ethan said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "That bear is the only thing keeping you alive right now." The leader's smirk faltered slightly. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ethan gestured subtly with his chin. Beyond the poachers, deep in the forest's shadows, more movement, more eyes, watching. The poachers had been so focused on Boone that they hadn't noticed the rest of the forest waking up. Wolves. A pack had gathered just beyond the tree line, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. Not hunting, not attacking, just waiting. Ethan had spent enough time in the wild to know one thing: nature had its own way of dealing with threats. The poachers saw it too now. One of them shifted uncomfortably, his grip on the rifle tightening. "Boss." The leader hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Ethan took the moment. With a swift, practiced motion, he snapped the trap open. Boone roared as his paw was freed, stumbling back before regaining his footing. Pain burned in his eyes, but so did something else, something primal. The poachers took a step back. The leader cursed under his breath, looking between Ethan, Boone, and the wolves beyond. They were outmatched. "This ain't over," he spat, signaling to his men. Then, just as quickly as they had come, they vanished into the trees. Ethan exhaled, his pulse finally slowing. The wolves lingered for a moment longer before slipping away, disappearing like ghosts into the night. Boone let out a deep breath, shaking his injured paw before turning to Ethan. For the first time, Ethan saw something new in the bear's eyes: understanding. Tonight, Boone had learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. In the wild, survival wasn't just about strength. It was about knowing when to fight and when to let the forest fight for you. And with that, the boy who had once been a captive, Bear was one step closer to becoming something greater, a true creature of the wild. The night was long, but the forest never slept. Ethan sat on a fallen log, rolling his aching shoulders as he examined Boone's injured paw. The bear had been licking the wound for the past hour, occasionally, letting out low, frustrated huffs. It wasn't deep, but it was a reminder. Boone had almost been taken. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He knew the poachers weren't gone for good. They would come back. Boone wasn't just a target to them. He was a prize. And if they saw him as nothing more than a sack of fur and muscle to be sold, then Ethan had to make sure they never got another chance. Boone shifted beside him, lifting his head as the wind rustled through the trees. His ears twitched, his nose flaring. Ethan noticed it too. The forest had changed. The quiet was different now. Not peaceful, but unnatural. Then, a gunshot. The sound cracked through the stillness like a whip, sending birds screaming into the sky. Ethan's blood ran cold. They had returned. Boone let out a deep growl, his fur bristling as he pushed himself to his feet. He limped slightly, but there was no fear in his stance anymore. His eyes locked onto the direction of the sound, his entire body tense, ready. Ethan knew what was coming before he saw them. The flickering glow of flashlights cut through the darkness, bouncing between the trees like restless spirits. The poachers were moving fast, their voices low but urgent. They were hunting, and Boone was the prey. Ethan clenched his jaw. Not this time. "Come on, buddy," he whispered, grabbing his rifle and moving toward the thick underbrush. Boone followed, his movements cautious but deliberate. They didn't run. Not this time. The clearing where they had confronted the poachers earlier now lay empty, the remnants of boot prints still fresh in the dirt. Ethan crouched behind a fallen tree, watching as the three men crept forward, their rifles gleaming under the moonlight. They were careful now. They had learned their lesson from before, but Ethan had learned something too. Boone wasn't just a bear anymore. He was a fighter. And tonight, they would fight together. Ethan took a slow breath, then rose from his cover, rifle at his side. "Looking for something?" he called. The poachers spun around, their flashlights blinding him for a second. Then, recognizing his voice, their leader let out a low, irritated chuckle. "Didn't think you'd be stupid enough to come back," he said, stepping forward. "Where's the bear?" Ethan didn't answer. Then from the shadows behind him, Boone emerged. The young bear stepped into the moonlight, his massive frame tense, his head held high. his dark eyes locked onto the men, his breath coming in slow, controlled huffs. There was no hesitation in him anymore. No fear. He was done running. The poachers hesitated. They had expected an animal. But Boone wasn't just an animal. He was a force of nature. The leader's hand hovered over his rifle strap. A mistake. With a deep, guttural roar, Boone charged. The men stumbled back, cursing as the bear closed the distance faster than they anticipated. Not attacking, just terrifying. His sheer size, his power, it was enough to send them scrambling. One of the poachers fumbled for his rifle, but Ethan fired first, a warning shot. The bullet struck a tree trunk just inches from the man's arm. "Sending bark flying! Drop it!" Ethan growled. The poacher froze, fingers twitching, but then slowly lifted his hands. He knew when he was outmatched. Boone didn't stop moving. He stalked forward, teeth bared, growls vibrating through his chest. He wasn't a cub anymore. He wasn't prey. The poachers knew it too. Their leader cursed under his breath, backing away. "You think you've won, Ranger?" he spat. "This won't be the last time." Ethan took a step closer, his rifle still aimed. "Yeah, it will be." The leader hesitated. Then, realizing there was no winning this fight, he turned and disappeared into the trees. The others followed. The forest swallowed them whole. Ethan didn't lower his rifle until the last sound of their footsteps had faded. The air was still. Heavy, but this time, it wasn't with fear. Boone let out a low huff, his massive body relaxing as he turned toward Ethan. And for the first time since this all began, Ethan saw it clearly. Boone had made his choice. He wasn't a runaway anymore. He was a protector. And as the wind rustled through the trees, as the forest slowly exhaled from the fight that had just ended, Ethan knew the battle was over. But Boone's story was just beginning. This chapter is packed with action, tension, and Boone's turning point from prey to protector. Let me know if you'd like any refinements. The first light of dawn spilled over the treetops, casting a golden glow through the thick forest. The night had been long, but the battle was over. The poachers were gone. Boone had stood his ground. Now, there was only one thing left to do. Ethan stood at the edge of a high ridge, overlooking a vast valley untouched by man. Below, a winding river shimmered in the morning sun, cutting through the dense wilderness. This was where Boone belonged. Behind him, Boone stepped forward, his massive paws pressing softly against the damp earth. He was stronger now, no longer the scared, lost cub Ethan had once rescued. He had grown into something greater. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them spoke louder than words ever could. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, buddy," he muttered, voice thick with something he wasn't ready to name. "This is it." Boone let out a deep, thoughtful huff, his dark eyes scanning the valley below. He understood. Ethan had known from the beginning that this day would come. He had spent months preparing Boone, teaching him how to survive, how to hunt, how to navigate the dangers of the wild. But nothing could have prepared him for the ache settling in his chest now. A part of him wanted to keep Boone close, to protect him from the world, but Boone didn't need protection anymore. He needed freedom. The bear shifted his weight, looking back at Ethan one last time, the same way he had done as a cub, the night Ethan had first found him. The same way he had done after Ethan had freed him from the trap. A silent question. A silent answer. Ethan forced a small smile. "You'll be all right," he said. "You always were." Boone blinked slowly, then turned toward the valley. And then he walked away. Ethan stood there, watching as Boone's massive form disappeared into the dense forest, swallowed by the very world he was always meant to be a part of. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. Because this time he wasn't escaping. He was going home. For a long time, Ethan remained where he was, listening to the rustling leaves, the distant calls of the wild. He had done his part. Boone's story would continue. But it was no longer Ethan's to tell. Finally, with a deep breath, he turned away and walked back into the trees, toward the only world he had ever known. Behind him, the forest welcomed its newest guardian, and Boone never looked back.